Delmar in for Aaron Rand, and turning our attention now to Europe, a very interesting, somewhat scary presidential election in Poland. This is certainly a concern for members of the LGBTQ community in Europe, as well as really all minorities, especially the Jewish minority in Poland. Very scary election there, and here to break it down is Anne Applebaum. You can read her in The Atlantic, as well as in print with a new book coming out. It's called Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Anne Applebaum, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Anne is joining us from just outside of Warsaw, Poland. Could you explain, Anne Applebaum, how the LGBTQ issue became such a focal point of the Polish election?
So it became a focal point because the current president, who's also a member of the ruling party, which is called Law and Justice, made it the focal point of the campaign. He actively campaigned against using the expression LGBT, which is sort of meaningless in Polish. I mean, it's an English language acronym, and I think lots of people not even sure really what it means. But he used it, and he gave probably the most noteworthy and most commented upon moment of the campaign was when he declared that LGBT is not people, it's an ideology. In other words, there are no people who believe in this thing that, it's just an ideology. And not only that, it's an ideology worse than communism. At the same time, public television, which in Poland has been completely politicized and taken over by the ruling party, put out multiple messages echoing this same theme. So people were told that that the National Independence Day parade will be replaced by gay pride parades, that children education will be sexualized in schools, and so on. It's important to remember that state television there's about a third of the country that doesn't get any other kind of TV. They don't have cable either because they can't afford it or it doesn't reach them. So this became a consistent, serious rallying point, really, for the president's campaign.
So this was an election issue. This moved a lot of votes. It wasn't merely a distraction, hiding some deeper divides, perhaps?
I mean, look at I can't tell you exactly why people voted the way that they did, but it was certainly a central theme of the campaign. It was talked about frequently. It was part of the messaging, and so that must indicate that the president's campaign team thought it was an important message. I mean, in Poland, it probably functions as much as, almost as much a kind of signifier. It tells Poland is very profoundly polarized, and it's very tribal politics, a little bit like the United States. And this kind of messaging is being sent to rural and traditional voters in particular, and telling them to be afraid of the cities and to be afraid of the outside world. It's probably also important to say two other things. One is that the opposition candidate, who is the mayor of Warsaw, is somebody who once signed a very mild, actually, sort of promise to do more for the gay community in Warsaw and to do some anti-discrimination training in schools, and none of which, as far as I know, has ever happened, although I could be wrong. And so he became a kind of symbol of foreignness, urbanness, anti-family, anti-church, even though he's none of those things in particular. I mean, he's very Polish, and he, they implied that he was doing things that he didn't. I mean, there are other issues in the campaign as well. I mean, the government has, in recent years and even in recent months, transferred quite a lot of money to the rural poor, and in particular to older people, through a kind of, by lowering the pension age quite significantly, and also through offering people a so-called 13th pension in advance of voting, actually. I mean, it's kind of open offer in advance of elections. So that has those were features too. But as I say, this was of the issues in the campaign, this was the one that was the most central and that was repeated the most in presidential propaganda.
Speaking of xenophobic elements in the campaign, there was also anti-Semitism that was present as well, perhaps to a lesser extent, but it's still there in a big way in the political culture in Poland. Could you explain where the Jewish community stands right now?
So it should be very important to be clear that, there is a long tradition of anti-Semitism in Poland, but it was not part of Polish politics in a significant way before, until very recently. But once again, this is a tool that was used by state television. And again, the line was that the mayor of Warsaw was somehow answerable to Jewish and foreign interests. And there was, some actual chyrons on television where, they said, will he answer to Jewish demands, something like that. And so that was another part of the messaging. Again, some of this is performative. I mean, I don't expect it to be followed up by, gangs in the street beating up gays or Jews. It doesn't function like that. These are messages to a part of the electorate that you're part of our tribe. We're true Poles as opposed to these somehow foreign or not real Poles or even traitors. And so that's how this kind of language functions. And again, these are tactics that we know from other countries and that are being used in other places, around the world now.
So it's not unsafe, you would say, for Jewish Canadians or Americans to travel to Poland. I've been trying to convince my father to not go back to his hometown of Zamość for quite some time now. Are my fears irrational?
No, I think it's perfectly safe. I mean, I'm Jewish. I live in Poland. There are other Jews who live in Poland. I think it's perfectly safe to visit here. I wouldn't say that. I mean, the ugliness of politics, hasn't translated into major street violence. I mean, I should say there was a political assassination here. The mayor of Gdańsk was murdered. That's a long and complicated story. That his, murderer was somebody who'd just been let out of prison, but he was somebody who'd been watching state television. But no, I don't think it's dangerous to be a Jewish tourist in Poland. There are quite a few of them.
Your new book is called Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. What is going on in the broader sense in Europe, in Poland, Hungary, and is it comparable to some of what we're seeing with the Trump movement in the States? Is it about economic anxiety and perhaps the vanishing manufacturing base?
My book argues that is not the full explanation. Although, again, my book is not about why people vote for these regimes, these parties. My book is really about the people who run them and invent the ideas behind them. So it's not a book about economics, although of course economics always plays a very important role. My book focuses on some of the cultural changes that have happened in recent years, and in particular the rise of tribal and polarized politics. If you think about it, democracy is a strange idea. The idea is that if you win an election, you then have to preserve the institutions that will allow your political enemies to win another election 4 years from now. And the idea that we continue to preserve this more or less even playing field and some neutral institutions, in a kind of neutral public sphere where we can debate, in some ways is kind of almost antithetical to human nature. And what we've seen in a number of countries is political parties coming to power who then, once in charge, seek to change the system so that they won't lose again. And that's that's happened already in Hungary. I don't see how it's possible now for an opposition party to win in Hungary because the system is essentially rigged against them. And in Poland, we're not there yet. I mean, we just had a big and very raucous presidential campaign, so you can't say there's no democracy here. But as I've been describing, state media, which is the equivalent of your, CBC or the BBC, has been captured and is now belongs to one party and is now being used for what would have been considered even 5 years ago, very extremist messaging of a kind that we did not have in Polish politics before 2015. And that's an indication of the kind of thing that can happen when a party with authoritarian instincts wins. So the ruling party in Poland's instinct is to change the rules to make it more difficult for their opponents to take over next time and to destroy, as I said, this neutral public sphere. And in my view, that's something that can happen anywhere. I mean, it can happen in any democracy. If the ruling party is vindictive enough, has enough power, and is able to achieve that.
Anne Applebaum, you can read her in The Atlantic. The new book is called Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, joining us from just outside of Warsaw. Thank you so much for the conversation today, Ms. Applebaum.
Well, thank you.